a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. My cat is lining up on the microphone. We have a coffee break during the day. How about a national coffee day instead? Let's turn Saturday into coffee day. I was thinking of Monday, but that day has too many issues. Julio has been making the best coffee in the universe since 2015. But he opened his first shop in 2016, the same time that I was starting Strange Things. If you like strange things and you want to drink the best coffee, swing by 4501 McPherson and see if I know coffee. If it's too far to drive, go to organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Coffee makes everything better, including coffee. I like coffee in my coffee. David Subith sent me an idea about how some of our heroes are suddenly no longer alive as soon as their usefulness comes to an end. I included some of what I've already talked about in previous shows simply because it is relevant to this show. So, if you've already heard me talk about General Patton and Amelia Earhart, folks like that, go with it or fast forward ahead. Abraham Lincoln is the reason the United States is still one big country. Had he not invited the South, well, I live down here and I have my issues. Okay, he kind of insisted that the South not run off and start our own country. Had history worked out differently, the entire world may have been different as well. The Secret Service hadn't been tasked with keeping killers away from the president, so Lincoln had to rely on other folks. During a train ride, he was accompanied by a young lady who was armed with a knife and a set of brass knuckles. The idea was using a gun inside a train car might accidentally get the president shot, so no guns were allowed. Folks would not expect the young lady sitting in the cab to be his guard. Well, she was. While attending that play at Ford's Theater, there was one soldier assigned to watch the president's back, and he nipped on downstairs for a drink. How convenient. We all know how that turned out. Andrew Johnson was the vice president. He had a really bad reputation for drinking, and AA wasn't around yet. When Lincoln was killed, Johnson was chosen to take his place. Back then, there was no line of succession. If the president died, Congress had to get together and decide who was going to take his place. That way, they didn't have to redo the entire national election again. So they just made Vice President Johnson president. Kind of like how that other Johnson was sworn in despite having no legal claim or authority to become president. I'll bet y'all didn't know that. Yes, LBJ chose himself to be president. It wasn't until the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was enacted February 10th, 1967, that we actually had a list of people who would step up and take control should things get bad. Both Johnsons were put in place despite having not being elected, and nobody really had any choice in the matter other than Congress the first time and Johnson the second. Lincoln had a lot of enemies. Most of them were not in the South. He had violated a few laws in the fight to keep the country intact. Once the job was done, he said there was to be no reprisals against the Confederate States. A lot of the crooked folks in Washington had seen this as the great opportunity to make themselves rich while destroying the South at the same time. They were given the title carpetbaggers. Now the country was safe. Lincoln was no longer needed at the helm. On the afternoon before the assassination, Booth paid a visit to the hotel where Johnson was living. They claim that he never actually met with Johnson, but he did leave his calling card saying, "I don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?" Why was John Wilkes Booth visiting Vice President Johnson the day before he shot the president? Mary Todd Lincoln wrote in a letter to a friend saying her own intense misery had been augmented by the thought that that miserable inebriate Johnson had cognizance of her husband's death. There is evidence that during the Civil War, Lincoln violated the official Union trade blockade by allowing a select group of Northerners to invest in Southern cotton. Lincoln did this to head off national bankruptcy and finance the Union war effort. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Textile mills in New York were also helping finance the South. Cotton was being hauled from the South into Mexico. It was loaded on ships that flew the Mexican flag and sailed into New York where it was sold. The money was then taken back to Mexico and shipped to the southern states to use to buy arms and ammunition. Otto Eisenschimel, born in Austria in 1880, was a chemist and an oil tycoon who developed a fixation on Lincoln's assassination. Following 9 years of research, he published Why Was Lincoln Murdered?, a book which argues that Lincoln's murder had been orchestrated by his own Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Eisenschimmel said that Stanton covertly teamed up with a small group of people looking to profit by taking over Southern territory. He said Stanton purposefully left an escape route open for Booth, whom he then ordered killed before the assassin could go to trial. There is plenty of evidence the guy shot in that tobacco barn was not Booth. Booth had been treated by Dr. Mudd for a broken left leg. The guy from the barn had a broken right leg. Orders were given to take Booth alive, but Boston Cabot shot him anyway. I watch those shows where somebody proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Booth was the shooter and he died in the barn. The only proof I see is what those people want us to see. I read books and I find a lot of alternate evidence. Ben Wade, a senator from Ohio, had said before Lincoln was shot, "By God, the sooner he is assassinated, the better." 19 months after the assassination, Booth's co conspirator, John Surratt, was tracked down by American officials in Alexandria, Egypt. It was revealed that he had served in the Papal Zuvis, a now defunct army that had fought on behalf of the Pope alongside the Union Army. During the Great War, 1914 to 1918, Japan and Italy had been allies of the US, Britain, and France. At the end of the war, the Big Three kicked Italy to the curb, but Japan was kind of handed free reign of the world on their side of the planet. No one much cared what happened to China, Korea, or the islands of the Pacific until it started to look like Japan was eyeballing countries like the Philippines, Indochina, and Burma. The US, Britain, and France had interests in these places. Plans were considered to try to keep an eye on Japan, but at the time this was a difficult assignment. Amelia Mary Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas, July 24th, 1897. She defied traditional gender roles from an early age. She played basketball, she took auto repair classes, and she went to college. Back then, there was something called a woman's place, which was in the home. Amelia Earhart was not going to stay in a woman's place. She did things she thought that any woman could do. 1917, Amelia dropped out of college and worked as a nurse's aide at the Spandina Military Hospital in Toronto as part of the Voluntary Aid Detachment Program. After the war, Amelia returned to the United States and enrolled at the Columbia University in New York as a pre-med student. After taking her first airplane ride in December, she was hooked. January 1921, she started flying lessons. Earhart passed her flight test in December 1921, earning a National Aeronautics Association license. 2 days later, she participated in her first flight exhibition at the Sierra Aerodrome in Pasadena. Earhart made her first solo non-stop flight across the United States by a woman. She started in Los Angeles and landed 19 hours later in Newark, New Jersey. She also became the first person to fly solo from Hawaii to the United States mainland in 1935. June 1st, 1937, Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. This would be her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. If you ever feel unappreciated, just think there was a second man in that plane. Oh, second person. Fred Noonan was her navigator. He was born in Cook County, Illinois, 1893. At the age of 17, he shipped out of Seattle as an ordinary seaman on a British ship. During the Great War, Noonan was an officer on three merchant ships that were all sunk by German U-boats. Following a 22-year career at sea, Noonan decided on a new career direction. He received a limited commercial pilot's license in 1930. In the following years, he was awarded Class Master Any Ocean. This qualification was similar to a merchant ship's captain. A lot of folks said that Fred was a drunk. They will say he was an alcoholic and he was probably drunk as the plane was approaching Howland Island, and therefore he was unable to navigate for Earhart. I hear this from a lot of folks. The first time Fred was accused of being a drunk showed up in 1966 when somebody was trying to sell their book. The writer claimed that Noonan had been arrested in Knoxville for a DUI. There is no police report anywhere that substantiates this tale. No police records anywhere saying that he was an alcoholic. Earhart was piloting a twin-engine Lockheed 10E Electra. The navigation equipment was situated in the rear of the plane. This was probably because there wasn't room up in the cockpit for all of his gear. They flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. By this time, they had already flown 22,000 miles. They had 7,000 miles to go in order to reach Oakland. Earhart and Noonan departed Lae from Howland Island. Their next refueling stop would be July 2nd. She and Noonan lost radio contact with the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca, anchored off the coast of Howland Island. Howland Island was 450 acres, uninhabited, just locally in the extremely remote part, located in the extreme part of the Pacific Ocean, almost halfway between Hawaii and Australia. Amelia Earhart's flight was a private publicity stunt. There was no government benefit as far as anybody could tell. Yet, Howland Island was cleared of most vegetation and a lighthouse was built by the U.S. government. An airport was set up for landing and refueling. There was a Coast Guard cutter stationed nearby to assist in finding this small island. As the pair were preparing to leave New Guinea and fly to Howland, they lightened the plane. A radio antenna was removed. You'd think something else could have been disposed of, not your radio. The radio is just about the most important thing you've got aside from fuel. Neither Earhart nor Noonan knew how to use wireless code. This prompted Earhart to also get rid of the telegraph key radio, as she felt it would be dead weight. You know, the dot, 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 dash, dash, dash mechanism. They didn't use it. They didn't even carry it. With just her and Noonan on board, they didn't either one know how to use the telegraph machine. Before departing, she also dropped a trailing antenna that would have allowed her to use the 500 kilocycle marine frequency. You know, the one the Coast Guard cutter was using? Instead of Morse code, Earhart planned to communicate by voice on higher bandwidths. While Earhart's plane was in the air, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca was waiting to guide her to Howland. Some of the ship's communications were on bandwidths that she didn't have the ability to receive. There were other difficulties. A radio direction finder on Howland that would work with Earhart's higher bandwidth equipment was battery operated. The batteries had drained down by the time she was getting close to the island. The ship's direction finder only operated on lower bandwidths. When all the arrangements were being made before takeoff, it wasn't as if Earhart was actually speaking with the Coast Guard. Somebody was talking to somebody who was talking to somebody else who was actually communicating with the people that were going to help her. Right up until the very last day, there were still a lot of questions on which frequencies to be used and if Earhart was going to use a voice radio or T-type transmissions. The folks doing all this discussion didn't realize she didn't know how to use the thing. 14 hours and 15 minutes into her flight, the Itasca received a first somewhat garbled transmission from Earhart about having cloudy weather. This message, though the message themselves would grow clearer, their content remained somewhat worrying, as when Earhart radioed, "We are circling, but cannot see the island, cannot hear you." She apparently only received one message from the ship, though the Itasca had been transmitting for hours. We all know how the story goes. President Roosevelt authorized a massive 2 week search for the pair, but they were never found. July 19th, 1937, Earhart and Noonan were declared lost at sea. The official position from the U.S. government is that Earhart and Noonan crashed into the Pacific Ocean, but there are numerous theories regarding their disappearance. The U.S. Coast Guard had been sporadic radio contact with Earhart. They received messages that she was lost and running out of fuel. In the week that followed, another 57 credible distress messages were heard at locations about the world. People swore they'd been in contact with Amelia Earhart weeks after the Coast Guard had said her plane was no longer in the air. Had they managed to land on some uninhabited island, their radio would still work as long as their batteries were charged. Looking at the situation in the light of today, people might wonder why the Coast Guard didn't try to focus on these radio messages. Some signals can bounce off the outer atmosphere and come down on the other side of the planet. Since the Coast Guard was using different radio frequencies, they could have been right next to the airplane and not heard from it. What we have here is a failure to communicate. The 20th century was a turbulent time in Japan. The country bounced between heights of power and wealth and the depths of poverty and devastation. After the dramatic effort to modernize politically, socially, economically, and culturally during the Meiji Restoration, Japan sought to control neighboring countries, competing with Western imperial ambitions. As soon as Japan invaded China in 1931, they bumped heads with Russia, leading to a war between Japan and Russia. Japan signed a treaty with Germany in 1937, saying they were going to support each other in a time of war. Germany then signed a treaty with Russia in 1939, who were currently fighting a war with Japan. Japan felt as if Hitler was stabbing them in the back, siding with Russia. Meanwhile, Chamberlain was still waving his piece of paper in the air, yelling, "Peace in our time." There were no spy satellites back then. If you wanted intel, you had to either sail to the country, get out and have a look, or fly as close as possible and see what you could see. Twin engine planes could go between 800 and 1,000 miles nonstop. Fuel would have been the biggest problem. The folks in Washington were aware that Japan had intentions of taking over more parts of the world. This was difficult to get details of things like how many ships their navy may have had, or were they building landing strips or fields on any islands. One theory about her disappearance is that Earhart had been recruited to spy on Japan and look to see if their navy was moving into places where they shouldn't be. Her flight plan was to take her along the southern coast of Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, and then over to New Guinea. Nowhere near Japan or any of its colonies. If I had been the one making the flight plan, I would have headed northeast from India. This would have run up the Pacific coastal countries right past Japan. Hey, they were our friends at the time. All the politicians kept saying so. Now, this would have made the flight just a little bit longer, but they would have avoided flying over the Pacific Ocean. The only open water would have been the Bering Straits. Their flight plan was to visit New Guinea and then cross 7,000 miles of open ocean with nothing but a tiny speck of an island as a safety net. At least that's what we are told. One theory is the plane actually headed north from Leh, flying over the islands along the way, looking for any signs of Japanese ships. They might have flown straight east from Bangkok, having a quick look at the islands in that area as well. I searched for any indication that either Earhart or Noonan had brought a camera with them. You'd think one of them would have brought along a means to document the long and historic flight. There's no record of either of them having a camera. Could they have been island hopping, looking for any indication of Japan was honing in on the countries to their south? Did they even need a photograph to tell the folks back in Washington that they had seen suspicious activity? Maybe all they needed was their written records. Upon hearing the missing flight, Japan contacted Washington and offered assistance in searching the area. Those who say Earhart and Noonan had been shot down by Japanese aircraft could still be right. Just because one branch of the government was doing something didn't absolve the other parts. Her Electra was equipped with several extra fuel tanks, giving her a distance of 4,500 miles. From New Guinea to Howland Island was 2,764 miles. That would give her 1,700 miles of spying time if that was what she was there for. She told the Itasca that she was running low on fuel. How could that be if she had flown straight to Howland Island from New Guinea, and she should have still had 1,700 miles worth of fuel on board? The plane was full when they left New Guinea. In a smoke and mirrors ploy, the Itasca could have been broadcasting messages never intended to be heard by Earhart or Noonan. Maybe they were only intended for the Japanese. The pair had removed a lot of radio equipment before that final flight. The war wasn't on yet, but Japan had already invaded China, Korea, Taiwan, and parts of Mongolia. In order to continue working their way south, the Japanese Navy would have been amassing ships and supplies on their southern extremities. Witnesses have been found who swear they saw a twin engine silver plane being transported on board Japanese ship. The pilot was a woman who dressed like a man, and there was another man with her. Would the folks in Washington have admitted that Earhart and Noonan were spying on one of our allies? Not in this lifetime. Governments spy on everybody, including their own people, but they refuse to tell people that they're spying on each other. It's one of those weird politics things. They all act as if it's just a conspiracy theory gone wild. If the pair of flyers had been shot down or even accidentally crashed on some island closer to Japan than they should have been, would anybody in Washington have asked nicely of Japan, "Hey, can we have our spies back, please?" Would they have even gone out of their way to acknowledge Earhart and Noonan? Alton Glenn Miller was born March 1st, 1904. Before the invention of amplifiers, if you wanted to play music to a huge room full of people, you had to have lots of musicians. This led to the creation of the big band. Glenn Miller was the leader of the Glenn Miller and his Orchestra big band. Miller was given a 3A classification, unlikely to be called to service due to his bad eyesight. At the peak of his civilian career, 1942, Miller decided to join the armed forces, which meant forsaking his income of about $20,000 a week. That's $330,000 in today's coin. October 7th, 1942, Miller reported to the 7th Service Command at Omaha as a captain in the Army Specialist Corps. Following a 1 month training, ASC training, course at Fort Meade, Maryland, he transferred to the Army Air Force November 25th, 1942. January 1st, 1943, Miller was assigned to the headquarters of the AAF Technical Training Command at Knollwood Field, Southern Pines, North Carolina. For the first several months of his commission, Miller did a lot of PR work for the military. He also entertained both civilians and military personnel. Like any new idea, Miller made enemies of a lot of traditional military musicians. He would, instead of playing the usual marching music, he would perform jazz and swing. Miller Marching Band became famous for using jeeps with drums mounted on them and stringed orchestras playing as they drove instead of marched. May 24th, 1944, General Eisenhower asked Washington if he would send Miller overseas to help the morale of those doing the actual fighting. With D-Day invasion just around the corner, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force established a combined Allied radio broadcasting service. Because of the threat the V-1 bombs were now making, Miller and his band were sent to Bedford. While there, part of his chain of command was Lieutenant Colonel David Niven. Now, a lot of you younger listeners won't know Niven from Gable. A lot of the actors I grew up watching were in the military during World War II. It's what you did. You didn't stand around on street corners and badmouth the government all the time. A different world. In England, the band kept an extensive schedule of personal performances, primarily at American air bases. That's why they were there, to boost the morale of the young men that may never go home. Military service personnel of all ranks enjoyed the band. Their concert at 8th Air Force Headquarters in Wycombe Abbey, England, was filmed by the American Forces Network on June 29th, 1944. During November 1944, Miller and Niven sought and received approval to move the unit from England to France. It was determined reliable radio broadcasting could be accomplished from Paris, and Miller's orchestra could be seen in person at Paris area hospitals and by ground troops on leave from the front lines. Some of y'all will realize just how important this can be during a time of war. Lift your spirits just a little bit so you stop thinking about maybe dying. December 11th, 1944, Niven ordered Miller to replace his executive officer and to fly ahead and complete arrangements before the entire group were shipped to Paris. Kind of the front man for the band. Miller was on standby for an early flight December 13th, but it was canceled due to bad weather in France. His reservation for December 14th was also canceled due to weather. Miller was frustrated and impatient, fearing that arrangements could not be made in time to accommodate the movement of his unit to France. December 15th, Miller was able to fly to France along with a section of the command unit that was heading that way. The next morning, the Battle of the Bulge began. The 8th Air Force and SHAEF did not realize that the UC-64 with Miller on board was missing for 3 days. It was December 18th before they knew that Miller was gone. Upon realizing the airplane and Miller were missing, Major General Orville Anderson ordered a search and an investigation. Miller's unit had flown safely from England to France aboard C-47 transports, and they were preparing to begin their broadcast and their concert duties. Since they were scheduled for a Christmas Day broadcast from Paris to England, news of Miller's absenteeism would have to be released. With the Battle of the Bulge raging, there were few resources available for a full-scale search. His body and the plane he was in, along with the crew and all the other service members, were never found. One theory is his plane was hit by a bomb that had been jettisoned by an RAF Lancaster traveling back to England after an aborted bombing run. The Lancaster's navigator recalled seeing the ejected bomb accidentally hitting a small plane. He said, "I remember seeing it spiraling out of control towards the water." Why would the navigator on a British airplane speak in a southern accent? I don't know a lot of accents. I don't do British very well. Another theory involves General Eisenhower, Adolf Hitler, and Lieutenant Colonel David Niven. Miller's flight landed in Paris without any problems. It then took off once more en route to Germany. Miller was acting under instructions from Eisenhower. He was to make contact with a group of German generals, which included Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt, all of who had become disillusioned by Hitler and his mismanagement of the war. Miller was there to try to broker a deal with these generals, encouraging them to topple Hitler and bring the war to an end. Miller had also been authorized to offer sanctuary to a number of German rocket scientists, including Werner von Braun. You see, Miller spoke fluent German. Well, his family was German, and he had originally been sent to England to make a series of radio broadcasts that were being transmitted into Germany. In these broadcasts, Miller, as well as playing some of his most popular music, called upon the Germans to lay down their weapons and surrender. Rommel and von Rundstedt would have recognized Glenn Miller simply because of his voice, because they had been hearing it on the radio. Eisenhower, it seems, was hugely impressed by Miller's efforts. So, too, was Miller's boss, Lieutenant Colonel David Niven, who may have been in the espionage business as well as his announced job. Miller's disappearance was not announced until a week after his plane went down. Add to this, the field that he was supposed to have flown from was closed all week due to bad weather. Is there any record of Miller having anything to do with cloak and dagger operations? No, but Julia Childs, the world famous French chef, was a spy working as an employee at the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA, during World War II. She first worked at the OSS in Washington, D.C., but afterwards she was sent to Sri Lanka and China, where she worked as the chief of the OSS registry. Childs worked as an intelligence officer during the war, coordinating information with many Allied places. Eric Weiss, better known as Harry Houdini, was a Hungarian American illusionist and a stunt performer. His tricks caught the eye of Scotland Yard and the American Secret Service. They asked him to infiltrate Russian police stations and get information from them. Some of what Houdini did for the authorities involved going to these police stations around the world, insisting on being locked up, and then using his escape artistry to impress the local law enforcement. At the same time, he was collecting valuable information, using his regularly scheduled tours as cover. Cary Grant, whose best movie, as far as I'm concerned, was Arsenic and Old Lace, was a real life spy employed by the British government. He was keeping tabs on suspected Nazi sympathizers during World War II. He was a strong supporter of the British cause. He donated his movie salaries throughout the war to the British War Relief and the Red Cross. A lot of people don't know it, but Cary Grant was from Canada. Marlene Dietrich was a German actress who proved herself to the FBI with a regular stream of reports from the front line where she was performing constantly for the U.S. troops during World War II. She was one of the few starlets suspected of spying not only for the Americans, but for the Germans as well. Because of that, she was constantly tailed by U.S. spies who were there to ensure that she was working for the right side. Sterling Hayden, better known as Colonel Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove, worked for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, parachuting into Croatia in order to spy on the growing fascist movements there. Christopher Lee. He played Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, lots of monster movies, all coming out of England. He was fluent in 6 languages. He had relatives of both Charlemagne and General Robert E. Lee. Christopher Lee was a member of the SAS during World War II, known as the Long Range Desert Group in North Africa from 1941 on. He was assigned to the Special Operations Executive, conducting reconnaissance in occupied Europe and tracking down Nazi criminals. Josephine Baker was a risque dancer who toured the United States with the vaudeville troupe. She moved to Paris in 1925, where she skyrocketed to fame in the city's music halls. Baker was nicknamed the Black Venus. She sang and acted in movies and became a major celebrity in Europe. Her scorn for the Nazis and their racism, coupled with her gratitude towards France, led Baker to serve during the war as an operative for the French resistance. Her performing career enabled her to travel around Europe without attracting suspicion. She attended numerous parties at embassies, gleaning whatever military and political information she could that might aid the resistance. She would smuggle intelligence secreted on invisible ink on her sheet music. She also used her chateau in southern France to hide Jewish refugees and weapons. Could Miller have been working for the intelligence community? There's no reason why he couldn't. If he was on some clandestine mission, the Army would want to keep it secret even after the war. Once secrets have been established, it is near impossible to unsecret them. As for the disposable hero moniker, had he been able to make contact with those German generals and they'd been able to do away with Hitler, Miller would have been a hero far more than the man who entertained millions of folks on both good and bad times. George Smith Patton Jr. was born November 11th, 1885, in Los Angeles. Patton believed that he was the reincarnation of several soldiers who had all died in the past. Though not directly descended from George Washington, Patton traced some of his English colonial roots to George Washington's great grandfather. Patton never considered a career other than the military. At the age of 17, he tried to get appointed to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He applied to several universities with Reserve Officer Training Corps, finally being accepted at the Virginia Military Institute. His father and grandfather had been at VMI. He attended the school 1903 and 1904, and though he struggled with reading and writing, he performed exceptionally in uniform appearance and military drill. While he was at VMI, Senator Thomas Bard nominated Patton to go to West Point. 1915, Lieutenant Patton was assigned to the Border Patrol duties with A Troop of the 8th Cavalry based out of Sierra Blanca, Texas. Up until the Great War, or the war to end all wars, better known as World War I, it was still considered the way to fight a battle was to line up and charge headlong into the enemy lines. Some troops were still on horseback. Equipment was pulled on wagons. Infantry was the main means of winning a battle. The so-called experts all said, the airplane has no use in combat. The first time an airplane was used by the military was February 1911. Lieutenant Fowlis and pilot Philip Parmalee took off from Fort McIntosh here in Laredo. The pair conducted the first ever air reconnaissance along the Rio Grande River. Their mission was to look for Mexican revolutionaries who were constantly invading towns and villages along the U.S. border. By early 1915, the First World War was in a stalemate, with thousands of soldiers dying daily along the 450 miles of fortified trenches that ran through Belgium and France. The deadlock could only be broken by finding a way to breach the trench system. Sending men over the top of the trenches, was doing nothing but getting folks killed. Gas was doing a great job at killing soldiers, but it was not getting anyone closer to winning. The idea was to build an armored vehicle that could drive across no man's land and cross a trench without having too much difficulty. Total security was used during the development stage. The vehicle were called land ships, and so the Navy was in charge at first. To keep spies from discovering what was being built, the word was put out that these vehicles were to carry water. They were called self-propelled water tanks. Patton was dissatisfied with mostly driving a desk while an actual shooting war was taking place. Most officers looked at the tank as a means of getting infantry across the enemy lines. Tanks were only support. Patton saw them as the future of warfare. November 10, 1917, Patton was assigned to establish the AEF Light Tank School. He was promoted to major January 26, 1918. He received the first 10 tanks March 23, 1918 at the tank school in Bourg. Patton trained tank crews to operate in support of infantry and promoted its acceptance among reluctant infantry officers. August 1918, he was placed in charge of the U.S. 1st Provisional Tank Brigade. For some reason that nobody can explain, a lot of the old guard absolutely hated any kind of a new idea. If they didn't think it up, it was wrong. At the end of the Great War, Patton went back to serving a peacetime military. The whole world was preparing for unlimited peace, all except for Germany. While armies all over the planet were being downsized, Germany began using covert methods of training for the next big event. Following the German army's invasion of Poland and the outbreak of World War II in Europe, the U.S. military entered a period of mobilization, and Colonel Patton sought to build up the power of the U.S. armored forces. Patton was promoted to a brigadier general October 2nd, made acting division commander in November, and October 4th, 1941, was promoted to major general, made commanding general of the 2nd Armored Division. Under Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, Patton was assigned to help plan the Allied invasion of French North Africa as part of Operation Torch in the summer of 1942. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, consisting of 33,000 men, 100 ships, and landing centered on Casablanca, Morocco, like the movie, not the lake here in Laredo. Have you ever heard the saying, it is better to have an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by a sheep? While most military men had been polishing their medals, Patton had been cleaning his sword. A lot of self proclaimed experts on how to fight battles were still reading books written in the 1800s. Patton was busy reading books written by the enemy. Bad things happen in war. No one side is evil and no one side is angelic. Nice guys do not make good soldiers. When informed of the Biscari massacre of prisoners, where 72 enemy prisoners had been shot, Patton told Bradley it was probably an exaggeration, but just in case, to tell the officers to certify that these dead men had all been snipers and that they'd been attempting to escape or something. Bradley refused to follow this not so much order as a suggestion. Two high profiles of Patton's striking subordinates during the Sicily campaign attracted national controversy. August 3rd, 1943, Patton slapped and verbally abused Private Charles Cool at an evacuation hospital in Nicosia after he had been found to be suffering from battle fatigue. August 10th, Patton slapped Private Paul Bennett under similar circumstances, ordering both soldiers back to the front line. Patton railed against cowards, and he issued orders to his commanders to discipline any soldier making similar complaints. Word of the incident reached Eisenhower, who privately reprimanded Patton and insisted that he apologize. Patton apologized to both soldiers individually, as well as the doctors who witnessed the incident, and later to all the soldiers under his command in several speeches. Eisenhower suppressed the incident in the media, but in November, journalist Drew Pearson revealed it on his radio program. Criticism of Patton in the United States was harsh and included members of Congress and a few former generals. The old guard that wanted to line up and charge into battle. The views of the general public remained mixed on the matter. Eventually, Secretary of War Stimson stated that Patton must be retained as a commander because of the need for his aggressive winning leadership in bitter battles which are coming in the near future. The German High Command had more respect for Patton than any other Allied commander and considered him to be the center to any planned invasion of Europe from England. It was common practice to study your opponents so you could figure out what they would do given various situations. Patton was made a prominent figure in the deception scheme Operation Fortitude during the first half of 1944. Though the British network of double agents, no, that's through the British network of double agents, the Allies fed German intelligence a steady stream of false reports about troop sightings and that Patton had been named commander of the 1st United States Army Group, all designed to convince the Germans that Patton was preparing a massive invasion at Pas de Calais. April 14th, 1945, Patton was promoted to general, 4-star general, a promotion long advocated by Stimson in recognition of Patton's battle accomplishments during 1944. Third Army was ordered to Bavaria and Czechoslovakia at the end of the war. Third Army was ordered towards Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, anticipating a last stand by Nazi German forces there. Patton was appalled when he found out that the Red Army was going to be allowed to take Berlin. He felt that the Soviet Union was a greater threat to the United States than the Nazis. Patton was appointed as the military governor of Bavaria, where he led the Third Army to denazifization efforts. Patton was particularly upset when learning of the end of the war against Japan. He wrote in his diary, "Yet another war has come to an end, and with it my usefulness to the world." Patton attracted controversy as the military governor when it was noted that several former Nazi Party members continued to hold political posts in the region. When responding to the press about the subject, Patton repeatedly compared Nazis to Democrats and Republicans, in noting that most of the people with experience in the infrastructure management had been compelled to join the party during the war. Patton's final assignment was to command the U.S. 15th Army based in Bad Neuhem. The 15th Army at this point consisted of only a small headquarters staff working to compile a history of the war in Europe. He intended to discuss with his wife whether he could continue in a stateside posting or should he retire from the Army. Patton's chief of staff invited him on a pheasant hunt near Speyer. The 1938 Cadillac limousine they were riding in collided with an American Army truck at a low speed. Patton hit his head on the glass partition that separated the front and the back seat. He began bleeding from a gash to his head, and he complained he felt paralyzed and he was having trouble breathing. Taken to a hospital in Heidelberg, Patton was discovered to have a compression fracture and dislocation of the cervical third and fourth vertebrae, resulting in a broken neck, and cervical spinal cord injury that rendered him paralyzed from the neck down. Patton spent the next 12 days in spinal traction to decrease the pressure on his spine. He died in his sleep of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure at 6 p.m. December 21st, 1945, at the age of 60. Well, that's what those people tell us. Man, I didn't know he was younger than I am. Patton was taken to an Army hospital where he was making rapid strides in recovery over the course of 12 days. His physician had given him medical clearance to make a transatlantic flight back home when suddenly, December 21st, 1945, Old Blood and Guts was pronounced dead. He was recovering. He was making fantastic steps towards getting back on his feet, and then he just fell over dead. No autopsy was performed. All the reports and investigations into the accident have mysteriously disappeared. 1979, an American spy with a sterling reputation named Douglas Bazata said that he had been ordered by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, to kill Patton and make his murder look like an accident. Another story is from a military officer who was on hand at the scene of the accident. Lieutenant Peter Babalis of the 818th Military Police. Around 11:45 a.m., he and his partner, Lieutenant John Metz, had passed Patton's car going in the opposite direction. They heard the crash, and so they turned around and proceeded to the wreck site. Babalis made an official investigation of the circumstances surrounding the accident, and he found that Patton's driver, Private Horace Woodring, and the driver of the truck that struck Patton, Robert Thompson, were both directly responsible for the accident. Almost immediately after the report, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division spirited Thomas out of Germany, sending him to England, where he stayed for a few days. The reason for his sudden trip to England was for his own protection. Douglas Bazata and his accomplices followed the general's car, and when Patton stopped at the Roman ruin along the roadside, Bazata put something in the window of Patton's auto that would leave an opening for a rifle shot. He said that they had an army truck that would run parallel to Patton's car and then would deliberately turn into it. When the truck hit Patton's car, a shot was fired, severely wounding Patton but not killing him. I accidentally got Bazata and Boblis's stories combined there. Bazata said that in the confusion of the moment, he went to the aid of the wounded general and then left among the confusion of the unfolding events. He then said he went to Patton's hospital with a poison concoction that had been made by both he and his accomplice, but he was unable to get into Patton's room. Bazata said the man who finally killed Patton went into his hospital room and used cyanide, which could cause heart failure or an embolism. A writer working on Patton's murder found a restricted OSS order while searching files at the National Archives that said that Bazata and another unnamed American officer had met in Washington, D.C. The meeting occurred in 1943 in a hotel so as not to attract any unwanted attention. Why would one of the most resourceful generals in the U.S. military be murdered by the U.S.? In the months before his death, Patton had become a powerful critic of the American government, its conduct of World War II, and its policies towards the Soviets. He planned to resign from the military after returning to the U.S. and then begin a major public speaking tour against American political leadership as one of our most celebrated war heroes, his denunciation would certainly have had a huge impact. Following World War II, Patton considered the next war was going to be with the Soviets. Although the wartime ally of the Americans, they would soon be our enemy. He wanted to fight the Soviets, knowing that they were spent after the war and thus very vulnerable. Patton said, "We defeated the wrong enemy," referring to the Soviets. U.S. investigators discovered large numbers of former German soldiers who should have been discharged were being kept in readiness in Alpine camps. Patton thought they'd be good as a spearhead of any assault. It was this discovery that precipitated Patton's removal as the governor of Bavaria. The war was over and we won, kind of. The Nazis never actually surrendered, only the German people. Look at all the Nazi members brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. How different would the U.S., as well as the entire world, have been had Patton been allowed to live? Who would have wanted Patton to no longer be among the living? There were a lot of folks who fought the war from behind a desk who feared Patton might return home and get into politics. Patton was known for his aggressive behavior and his unwillingness to bend when not bending was the thing needed. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. That was a lot of information, some of which I had to repeat because, like I said, it was necessary for the show. If you have any good stories that you'd like to share or maybe see them in print sometime, I'm looking for anything to do with UFOs, ghosts, uh, cryptid encounters, or anything that falls under the category of being just plain weird. If you have anything like that, or you've heard it from somebody and you believe it to be a true story, you can send it to me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they're strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.